Okay, so I added a third session to today's lecture because there is two more issues that I want to explain and analyze within this Eurobarometer survey. Now I will turn off my camera and I will. Okay, so I added a third session to today's lecture because there is two more issues that I want to explain and analyze within this Eurobarometer survey. Now I will turn off my camera and I will share my screen with you. Presentation here, and Um, we will discuss the responses of the European citizens to the question on potential obstacles to the integration of immigrants. Okay, in the previous session, we discussed several different questions that were asked to the European citizens about the immigrants within the European Union. And we analyzed the answers of the respondents to these questions. Now, this question measures the European citizens' attitudes towards the obstacles to the integration of immigrants. In this question, respondents were asked to consider which factors can be considered as obstacles to integration. And you can see the categorization of these obstacles. In the first one, you can see the difficulties in finding a job. In the second one, we find the discrimination against immigrants. In the third one, we find the limited efforts by immigrants to integrate. In the fourth one, we find the difficulties in accessing long-term residence permits, and it goes on like this. So let's look at the ratios of the respondents who confirm these issues as the main obstacles to integration of immigrants. So as you can see, the first one, difficulties in finding a job, was presented as the biggest obstacle by the largest share of respondents. It is the 69% of respondents. So the European citizens in general considered the major obstacle for the immigrants to integrate within the European Union as the difficulty in finding a job. In the second category, 67% of the respondents identified the limited efforts by immigrants to integrate within the societies of the EU. In the third category, again 67% of the respondents identified discrimination against immigrants as a situation that can prove obstacles to integration. Okay, the fourth category is the high concentration of immigrants in certain areas, and 64% of the respondents considered this factor as an important obstacle to the integration of immigrants. Another important factor with 62% of ratio is the difficulties in accessing long-term residence permits. And the same ratio is given to the negative portrayal of immigrants in the media. So 62% of the EU citizens who surveyed by the Eurobarometer responded that the immigrants' negative portrayal in the media contributes to the less of integration of immigrants in these societies. So this generates a serious obstacle. Okay, so you can see that these results of the Eurobarometer survey tell us important um, public attitudes in the European Union. I want to go back to the beginning of this presentation here. Here, okay. You can see that the majority of the EU citizens now perceive to have an immigrant in terms of their close social interaction as normal. So, as you see, the attitudes and the perceptions of the EU citizens are changing towards immigrants into a more positive direction. Okay, now we have seen the obstacles to integration, and finally, okay, finally we will look at the measures to support the integration of immigrants. Okay, here, in this context, the respondents were asked questions about if they think that their countries are implementing the necessary measures to integrate the immigrants into the society, or if there is a problem in this context. So the answers of the respondents are given in this research outcome. Okay, so a majority of Europeans agree that it is necessary for their country to invest in integrating immigrants within the society, and this ratio is 69% of the respondents. 53% of the Europeans agree that the national governments are doing enough for this integration. Okay, the respondents are also asked if they agree or not with the statement that actively promoting the integration of immigrants is necessary investment in the long run for their country, and a clear majority, 69% of respondents agreed to this statement. Only 15% of the respondents tend to disagree with this statement. You can see that in the pink color in the first line. And only 8% of the respondents totally disagreed with this statement. You can see it in red in the first line. Okay, so within this question, we can see that the active promotion of the integration of immigrants is perceived as a necessary investment in the long run for these host countries. Okay, so if you look at the second category, you can see that among the respondents in this survey, 53% of respondents agreed that their national governments is doing enough to actively promote the integration of immigrants into the society. Okay, now we will look at the country-based results because this is more explanatory than the general answers. Here you can see the same question on the country basis among the EU member states. Okay, so when you look at the country results, you can see that more than half of the respondents agree on the benefits of actively promoting the integration of immigrants as a necessary investment in the long run for their country. On the left-hand side, you can see the result for Sweden, which is the highest ratio. 92% of the Swedish people who are surveyed in the context of this Eurobarometer poll agreed that this is necessary. This is followed by the 88% of the respondents in Ireland and in Denmark. You can see them in the second and third lines. You can see the fourth one as Luxembourg with 86% of the respondents agreeing on this statement. And the lowest rates for this statement came from Lithuania with 40% of the respondents, and it is followed by Greece and Slovakia with 42% of the respondents, and Bulgaria with 43% of the respondents. So in this category, uh, we find the ratios of the EU citizens who agree that active promotion of the integration of immigrants is a necessary investment for their country in the long run. Here in this chart, you can see the country-based differences within the European Union. Okay, so this Eurobarometer research, tell us a great deal about European citizens' values, perceptions, and attitudes towards immigration. In the first part of the lecture, we analyze these perceptions and attitudes of immigration from the theoretical approach, to the theoretical perception. And in this first session, we focused on the theoretical approaches or explanations to uh, the European citizens' attitudes and perceptions of the European integration and immigration. Okay, we used several academic studies as validations of these theoretical arguments. In the second part of the lecture, we moved on to the practical analysis on the same question. And in this context, uh, we have analyzed the actual variations among the EU respondents regarding the immigration within the EU. So here you can see that European citizens are considering the immigrants as their friends, colleagues, neighbors, doctors, and they are increasingly establishing personal connections and interactions with the immigrants. Uh, with respect to their general perceptions and attitudes towards immigrants, Europeans showed diversified opinions, but in general, um, the but in general, as you can see on this slide, they perceive this issue, the immigration, as equally a problem and an opportunity, with 38% of the respondents. You can see that only 22% of the European citizens perceived immigration as more of an opportunity than a problem. You can see it in blue on the right hand side. When we look at the country-based responses, of course, there are big variations among different countries, but even on the country-based analysis, we can see that Europeans are substantially more likely to say that immigration represents both a problem and an opportunity. You can see the rates of such responses in this chart. Therefore, we cannot say that the European citizens have have a common perception over immigration, but there are diversified responses among the EU countries. However, we have already said that when we consider the personal experiences of the EU citizens towards immigrants, we find that the majority of Europeans feel comfortable with immigrants as being their friends, neighbors, or work colleagues. So, at the social level, we don't find a clash of identities or connections at the personal level, but we find the major problems about the successful integration of the immigrants in their host societies. And in this regard, concerning what constitutes as a successful integration, the most common answer by the EU citizens appeared as being able to speak that country's language. So 85% of the respondents argued that speaking the country's host country's language is an important issue for the successful integration of immigrants. This is followed by the contribution of the immigrants to the welfare system by paying taxes. And finally, the other high ratios came with being committed to the way of life in the host country with 78% and having educational qualifications and skills that are sufficient to find a job in the host country with 77% of the respondents. So these are the main obstacles. These appear as the main obstacles to the successful integration by the EU citizens. Now we will turn off this screen sharing. Okay, now you can see only me in the camera. Okay, in this lecture, we analyzed the article which is presented in the week 8 in your Sanal Campus online system. So please refer to this article which is already uploaded to your Sanal Campus online system for more references about today's lecture. You will find the theoretical discussions regarding the national identities, European integration, and fear of immigration in this week's article. Uh, if you can also watch the first session and second session of today's lecture, you will be informed about these theoretical and practical approaches to this subject. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture. Now we've reached to the end of this session and have a nice evening. Presentation here.